Before we begin, drop in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. By the time this is finished, you will understand why the hour matters. There are testimonies that the communities that produce them spend decades deciding whether to release. Not because the witness is unreliable, not because the account lacks corroboration, but because the community itself, its internal coherence, its relationship with the outside world, its capacity to be taken seriously by the institutions that surround it, has a stake in what gets said publicly, and what remains inside the boundary of shared knowledge that every closed community maintains as a condition of its own survival. The Old Order Mennonite communities of Lancaster and Lebanon counties in Pennsylvania are not communities that speak carelessly to outsiders. They do not seek attention. They do not make public statements about matters they consider internal. Which is why the testimony given by Elder Amos Byler of the Conestoga Creek settlement to a Pennsylvania state folklorist named Dr. Ruth Warwick in the spring of 1961, and the account that testimony contains of what the Conestoga Creek community had been observing at the edge of their eastern woodlot for the better part of 30 years, represents something that does not fit the ordinary pattern of how that community manages its relationship with the world outside its fence lines. Byler was 74 years old when he spoke to Warwick. He had been an elder of the community for 19 years. He had, by Warwick's account, spent 3 weeks deciding whether to speak at all. When he finally did, he spoke for 4 hours. And what he described, carefully in sequence, without embellishment and without the vocabulary of the supernatural, in the plain language of a man reporting what had been directly observed by himself and by members of his community over 3 decades, has sat in the Pennsylvania Folklore Archive at the University of Pennsylvania for 63 years, in a collection classified as restricted oral history, available only to credentialed researchers with written departmental approval. Tell me where you are watching from. You need to understand what this community was and what it cost Amos Byler to speak. The Old Order Mennonite community along the Conestoga Creek in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in the early decades of the 20th century, was a settlement of approximately 40 families who had maintained their separateness from the surrounding Pennsylvania Dutch country, with the quiet, principled consistency that defines Old Order practice. No electricity, no motor vehicles, worship in the homes of community members on a rotating schedule, German as the primary domestic language, with English used for necessary transactions with the outside world and no more. The community's eastern boundary was defined by a woodlot of mature second-growth hardwood, oak, hickory, black walnut, with a dense understory of spicebush and pawpaw that ran along the creek's eastern bank for approximately 3/4 of a mile before giving way to a series of cultivated fields belonging to non-Mennonite farming families. The woodlot was not deep. A man walking directly through it reached the far side in under 20 minutes. It was not remote, not wild, not the kind of terrain that produces mystery by virtue of inaccessibility. It was an ordinary Pennsylvania woodlot of the kind that dots the Lancaster County landscape in the spaces between family farms. It was what emerged from that woodlot at dusk, on specific evenings across a span of nearly 30 years, that Amos Byler spent 4 hours describing to Ruth Warwick in the spring of 1961. Byler was, by Warwick's written assessment, included in the prefatory notes to the transcript she deposited with the Pennsylvania Folklore Archive, a man of exceptional observational precision. A farmer for 50 years, a community elder for 19. A man whose daily life had trained him to notice small deviations from established pattern, because in agricultural work, those deviations carry practical consequences. He was not given to imprecision in language. He was not, Warwick noted with some emphasis, a man who used words he did not intend. When she asked him at the outset of their conversation why he had decided to speak to her after 3 weeks of consideration, he said, in the careful English he used for their interview, "Because we have watched for 30 years, and we do not understand it, and I am 74 years old. And if I do not say it to someone outside, it will stay with us until everyone who saw it is gone, and then it will be as though it was never there. And I do not think it is right for a thing that was there to be treated as though it was not." He was born in 1887. He had farmed the same parcel of Conestoga Creek land his entire life. He had observed the eastern woodlot from his farmyard, from his fields, and from the creek bank throughout that life, with the attentive regularity of a man whose property runs to its edge. He knew every tree in it by the silhouette it made against the sky. He knew which deer trails ran through it and where they turned. He knew what the woodlot looked like at every hour of the day across all 4 seasons, in the specific and unreflective way that a man knows the features of land he has worked beside for 60 years. The first wrong thing happened in the autumn of 1931. He was 44 years old. He was walking the fence line along the woodlot's northern edge at dusk, checking for gaps that the autumn wind had opened, when he became aware that the woodlot's interior was producing a sound he did not recognize. Not animal. He was clear on this in the transcript and returned to the clarification multiple times when Warwick pressed him on it. He had heard every animal in that woodlot across 6 decades. Deer, fox, raccoon, great horned owl, the barred owl, the occasional bear working the creek bottom. This was not any of those. It was, he said, periodic, rhythmic in the way of something intentional, rather than in the way of an animal sound, which follows the logic of the animal rather than any external structure. Low enough in register that he felt it as much as heard it. He stood at the fence line and listened for approximately 10 minutes. Then it stopped. Then the woodlot was the ordinary woodlot again, and the ordinary birds moved in it, and the ordinary dusk came down over the creek. He told his wife that evening. He noted it in the farm journal he had kept since 1910, a volume that Warwick was permitted to examine and from which she transcribed the relevant entry into her archive notes. The entry reads, in the German of Byler's domestic writing, "Something in the east wood this evening at dusk. Not an animal I know. Periodic sound. Low register. Duration perhaps 10 minutes. Stopped without cause I could identify. Will watch." He watched for 3 years before the second event. And in that watching nothing occurred that he added to the farm journal under the heading he had established for the Eastwood observations. A heading he had written, Warwick noted, in a different ink than the surrounding entries, as though he had prepared the category in advance of needing it again. When the second event came, in October of 1934, it was not a sound. 2 of Baylor's adult sons, Levi and Samuel, were working the creek bottom field at the woodlot's southern edge in the late afternoon, when the light began to fail. They came in for the evening meal and reported to their father, separately and without having coordinated their accounts. Warwick confirmed this by interviewing both men, who were in their 60s by 1961, in sessions that Byler did not attend, that at the moment the sun dropped below the western ridge and the creek bottom entered full shadow, something had moved at the woodlot's edge. Not through the woodlot. Not out of the woodlot. At its edge, along the boundary line where the tree trunks met the field, in the shadows that the last of the light left between the trunks. Both sons described it the same way, a movement that did not resolve into a shape they could identify, but that was too large and too deliberate to be any animal they could name, moving parallel to the field edge from south to north before disappearing into the deeper shadow of the interior. Levi Byler, who was working the southern end of the field and had a slightly longer sightline, estimated the movement's duration at roughly 30 seconds. He estimated its height, the vertical extent of the disturbance in the shadow at the tree line, at something above the fence posts, which stood 5 feet. But he would not commit to a more specific estimate, and told Warwick, 30 years after the fact, that the reason he would not commit was that the light was failing, and he was not certain his estimate was reliable, and he was not willing to say something he was not certain of. His father recorded both accounts in the farm journal the same evening. The entry under the Eastwood heading is the longest in that section of the journal. Warwick transcribed it in full. Its final sentence, in Byler's German, translates as, "We do not go to the East Wood after the sun is below the ridge. This is now the rule." And then it escalated. Over the following 12 years, from 1934 to 1946, the Conestoga Creek community accumulated observations that Byler had documented in the Farm Journal and that he presented to Warwick in chronological sequence during their 4-hour session. The pattern across those observations was consistent in 3 specific ways. First, every event occurred at the same interval of day, the period between the sun dropping below the western ridge and the full arrival of dark, which in Lancaster County varies between 15 and 40 minutes depending on season. Second, every event occurred at the woodlot's boundary rather than in its interior or in the open fields, at the precise line where the cultivated land met the first rank of trees. Third, every event stopped when full dark arrived. Whatever moved at the tree line in the dusk interval was gone by the time the stars were fully visible. It did not continue into the night. It did not come into the fields. It remained, across 12 years of accumulated observation, precisely at the boundary, precisely in the failing light, and precisely until the dark made the boundary irrelevant. In the summer of 1938, a community member named Ezra Lapp, whose farm occupied the southeastern corner of the settlement, and whose fields ran closest to the woodlot's southern end, reported to Byler that he had, on 3 consecutive evenings, seen what he described. And Byler transcribed this directly into the Farm Journal in quotation marks, attributing it to Lapp by name, as a watching. Not a movement, not a shape, a watching. A quality of attention directed from the tree line toward the farm buildings, which Lapp said he had become aware of not by seeing anything specific, but by the response of his livestock. His draft horses, penned in a paddock that faced the eastern woodlot, had for 3 consecutive evenings in that week become agitated at exactly the interval when the light began to fail. Not the ordinary agitation of animals responding to a predator scent, which Lapp knew well, but a stillness first, followed by a turning of all the animals in the same direction, toward the tree line, and then a pressing together at the far end of the paddock, away from the wood. Lapp said the horses did this until full dark and then stopped and were normal again. He said it happened 3 evenings in a row and then did not happen again that season. Byler recorded this. Then he went and stood in Lapp's paddock at dusk himself, on an evening the following week. He stood there for the full interval. He told Warwick that he had not seen anything that he was able to describe with confidence. But he said something else, which Warwick flagged in her archival notes as the most significant statement of the 4-hour testimony. He said that standing in the paddock at that interval, facing the tree line, he had become aware of a quality of attention that he could not account for by reference to anything in his 60 years of observing that woodlot. He said it was not a sound, and not a shape, and not a movement. He said it was the experience of being observed by something that understood it was being looked at in return, and did not move or change or react to that understanding. Something that could absorb a direct human gaze and return it with a patience that had no edge he could find. He stood there for the full interval. He went inside when full dark arrived, the same way whatever was at the tree line resolved into the dark. He wrote in his farm journal that evening, "I do not know what watches from the east wood at dusk. I know that it watches. I know that it stops when the dark is full. I do not know what the stopping means, whether it leaves or whether it simply no longer needs the dusk to see by." The Conestoga Creek community maintained its rule. No one at the woodlot's edge after the sun dropped below the western ridge through the remainder of the 1930s and through the 1940s. The observations continued at irregular intervals. The Farm Journal documents 11 additional events between 1938 and 1958, each consistent with the established pattern in its timing and its boundary-specific character. In 1946, the community discussed among its elders whether to clear the woodlot entirely, to remove the tree line and eliminate whatever function the boundary between the cultivated and the wooded land was serving. Byler told Warwick that the discussion lasted through 2 full community meetings and was resolved against clearing. For a reason that he offered without apology or embarrassment, they did not know what clearing the woodlot would produce, and they had learned over 15 years of observation that what was at the tree line at dusk had, across all that time, stayed at the tree line. It had not come into the fields. It had not come to the farm buildings. It had observed from the boundary and stopped at the dark and returned at the next dusk interval that drew it out. The community had accommodated itself to its presence, and the accommodation had held. They were not willing to disrupt an arrangement whose terms, however unsettling, had proven stable. Outside, the fog had settled into the creek bottom. The woodlot was still. The last entry in the Eastwood section of Byler's Farm Journal is dated September of 1959, 2 years before his conversation with Warwick. It records nothing observed. It records instead the absence of the pattern, for the first time in 28 years of monitoring the dusk interval at the tree line. The autumn of 1959 had passed with no event of the kind the journal had been tracking. He had stood at his fence line on multiple evenings through October and November. The horses had been undisturbed. The woodlot's edge had been what it appeared to be, an ordinary stand of mature hardwood at the end of a Lancaster County field, holding the ordinary silence of a Pennsylvania autumn. Whatever had been at the boundary at dusk for 28 years was not there. He did not know where it had gone. He did not know whether gone meant something that could be relied upon. The journal's final Eastwood entry, translated from his German, reads, "The wood is quiet this season. I am not certain whether to call this a relief or a warning. I have decided to call it neither. I will watch." He died in 1964, 3 years after his conversation with Warwick, at the age of 77. The Farm Journal was retained by the Byler family. It has not been made available to outside researchers beyond the transcriptions that Warwick made during her 1961 sessions. The eastern woodlot of the Conestoga Creek settlement still stands. The community, reduced in size from its mid-century population, but continuous in its practice, has made no public statement about the East Wood or about Byler's 1961 testimony. The Pennsylvania Folklore Archive transcript is accessible to credentialed researchers by written request to the University of Pennsylvania Folklore and Folklife Department. It has been accessed 6 times since its deposit in 1961. No publication drawing on the transcript has appeared in any peer-reviewed journal in the intervening 63 years. Here is what Amos Byler's testimony leaves open, and it will not close from any direction that offers easy comfort. A man of demonstrated precision and deliberate speech, supported by a farm journal spanning 28 years of consistent entries, by the corroborating accounts of two adult sons interviewed independently, and by the tacit confirmation of an entire community that had organized a behavioral rule around what it had seen. That man described something at the tree line of a Lancaster County woodlot that came at dusk, stayed at the boundary, watched, and stopped when the dark arrived. It did so across 28 years. And then it stopped entirely, 2 years before he told anyone outside his community about it, for reasons he could not identify and would not speculate about. Is the most disturbing version of this account the 28 years of presence, or the 2 years of absence before he decided, at 74, running out of time, that someone outside the fence line needed to know? He spent 3 weeks deciding to speak. He spoke for 4 hours. And the thing he had been watching for, and that had been watching back, had been quiet for 2 years by then. What do you believe Amos Byler saw at that tree line? A pattern of natural phenomena that the community's isolation caused them to interpret with an attention that a less observant culture would have dismissed? Or something that understood the boundary between the woodlot and the field precisely because that boundary was the limit of what it was permitted to cross? Drop your answer below. If these testimonies, the recorded ones, the ones with archive numbers and farm journals, and the careful words of men who spent 3 weeks deciding whether to speak, are what you want to keep finding, subscribe and ring the bell. We have more. None of them are easy ones. Do not stand at a tree line when the light is going. Whatever Amos Byler watched from his fence line, watched him back for 28 years. And when it stopped, he did not call it a relief. Neither should you.